Again, hello everyone to our International Education Week at the University of South Dakota. Today we have a really interesting guest speaker. We have Julie from WorldStrides, and she talks about her personal story.
All right, wonderful. Thank you so much, Holger. I appreciate you having me here. As Holger mentioned, my name is Julie Alexander. I work for WorldStrides. Essentially, in my role, I most of the time work with faculty and education abroad office, study abroad staff, and helping design and facilitate faculty-led short-term study abroad programs. For your students out there, essentially what that means in a nutshell is when your professor is taking you to another country or even domestically on a course that's being taught for credit, I'm usually the one who's behind the scenes helping with the education abroad office and collaborating with that professor on logistics, content, what have you. And a little bit of a background before we jump into the story today. Before I came to work at WorldStrides, the majority of my background is in higher education. I worked both as full-time administrative staff at a college similar to a whole, and also I taught as an adjunct college instructor in departments of communication at our local community college and also our local university. So I truly value higher education and find myself to be an educator. And that's part of the reason why I'm so happy to be here speaking with you today, because I miss my college students. I haven't taught in the last few years since I've been at WorldStrides, and I don't always get to interact with you directly. In my particular role, I'm usually the one behind the scenes, behind the curtain, if you will. And so it's so nice to get to meet all of you today. Now, that said, I do want to kind of talk to you a little bit about our goal of the presentation today and why I'm here talking with you. You can see from the title that essentially I'm going to be sharing some personal information, a personal journey that I had to approach as I was a student, both on the undergraduate level and the graduate level, looking to explore studying abroad. And coming from a rural background myself, kind of my journey in doing the research to discover how I could empower myself to have global education. So just to give you a brief overview today, essentially, I'm just going to set the tone for the presentation, and then we're going to have a few activities that are related to self-reflection and identity, because if we're talking about a personal journey, well, the center of one's journey is oneself, right? And so in order for us to truly understand outside of ourselves, it helps for us to have awareness about our own identity. So we'll talk a little bit about that. I want to talk to you a little bit about students that maybe come from more rural backgrounds, which some of you maybe do at University of South Dakota. I know I do myself, and talk about how that impacts kind of where you live and your experience going to university and potentially studying abroad. And then I'll tap into some of my own personal journey with studying abroad and the decisions and research that I did, and sharing some resources and some thought prompts with you as you're evaluating programs to see what's the best fit for you as a person. But that all said, before I jump in, I would like to have a few disclaimers and just, again, set the tone for the presentation today. I am an out LGBTQ plus person. I identify as lesbian. I have been out for quite some time. That said, I am a conglomeration of intersectional facets of identities, which we'll talk about a little bit later, right? So while I may be marginalized by certain facets of my identity, I have privilege in others, right? So therefore that limits my perspective, and my own personal experiences are just mine. I can't speak on behalf of the whole LGBTQ community. I cannot speak on behalf of the rural community. I can't speak on behalf of any identity facets that I don't personally identify with, right? So my hope is that today you keep that in mind and have some grace and some openness as we're discussing through some things. I'm going to be talking, frankly, about some personal stuff that I've never spoken publicly about before today. And the reason for that is because I think that it's important that we're able to get vulnerable and share a little bit, because only through discussions can we really progress in our own thought processes of how we interact with other people, but also with ourselves. Right. So please, I only ask that this is kept as a safe space and that we show everybody compassion here. So let's focus on the self first before I jump into the whole personal journey story. You'll see on the screen, I have a wheel here. And on this wheel, you'll notice that I have quite a few different types of identity facets, right? You'll notice towards the center of the wheel, you have age, sexual orientation, identity, ethnicity, race, gender, ability, status. And then out from that, branching out further from that, you'll notice everything from appearance to marital status, to military experience, to educational background, socioeconomic status, geographic location. And these are all facets of identity that we all carry with us, right? And some of our identity facets might be more salient to us than others, which means that we think about them more often. Maybe they really color our experiences and perceptions of the world and how we interact with other people and how other people interact with us. So before I move forward, because this really comes down to being comfortable in the discomfort of exploring one's identity, I do want to take a moment and pause and ask you to do an exercise with me, okay? I want you to take a look at this wheel. And then I want you to think to yourself about what identities are the most salient for you. What identity facets really speak to you that you think about a lot on a day-to-day basis? Maybe it's your age, maybe you're a parent, right? Maybe you're taking care of your parents as a son or daughter or a person. Think about those things, right? And then I want you to flip that and think about what are some of your identity facets that you kind of don't think about from day to day? What don't you analyze from day to day? Right? For example, I'm white. I don't think about my race very often. I have this year, and growing up I have, but that's not something that I have to think about on a daily basis. But my friends and colleagues who are people of color, to include my spouse, they do have to think about that on a daily basis, which leads me to my next part of the exercise. I want you to think about, of these identities, which of them are apparent and which of them are non-apparent? And how do you feel that that might influence people's interactions with you and your perceptions of the world? For example, physical ability status. If you're in a wheelchair, that is a very apparent disability. If you have a hearing aid, it's a very apparent disability. What people may not be able to notice is cognitive or learning disabilities, right? Dyslexia, for example, is an invisible, non-apparent part of your identity, but it impacts you. And our identities and roles fluctuate from day to day. In some contexts, you might feel a lot more aware of, say, your age than in others. In some contexts, you're going to feel a lot more aware of your gender than in others. It constantly fluctuates. So I do want to keep this in mind as we move forward and talking about your own personal journey with identity. And I do want to zoom out at this point and talk about what it means to be a rural LGBTQ plus person. I have this map up on the screen. I love these numbers because I think that there's a misconception out there that if someone is LGBTQ plus, that they're immediately flocking to these metropolitan areas, that I'm in New York City or Los Angeles or San Francisco or Atlanta or Denver or Austin. And the truth of the matter is the vast majority of LGBTQ plus people are actually living in rural areas. They're not in heavily metropolitan establishments, right? For example, this is where I'm from. I'm from the Southeast. I'm from the deep Southeast, okay? And when I grew up, I was in a very, very small rural town in the South, and that's all I knew. I was very siloed in my own little small town bubble, if you will, when I was growing up. And I didn't really know much about the world outside of what other people told me or what I maybe saw on television or when I went to the movies or in the books that I read. Like the most I knew about England for the longest time is what I read in Harry Potter. I'll be blunt, right? And so for me, my perception of the world was so incredibly shaped by my experience by being a rural small town student, right? Being brought up in that way, which leads me to another exercise that I'd love to do with you, talking about perception versus reality, right? Perception is something that is completely subjective. It's something that, again, those identity facets might inform for us and what we think we know about the world. But sometimes it's like a tip of the iceberg. It may not be the most accurate or the most complete of the stories of the world, right? The reality could be really far deep under that surface as far as perception versus reality goes. And growing up in a small town, I definitely felt this on a deep, deep level much later in life, because all I had for the longest time about the world that I knew about was all from perception, not necessarily from firsthand experience or reality. So let's do an exercise. I want you to think about China. Okay. And if you've been to China, I know some of you on this call have. If you have been to China, I want you to think about a place that you have never been to before. Okay. Now, I want you, if you have a pencil and pad, feel free to write this down. I want you to write out for me or yourself everything you know about China. Think about it. Think about all the things you know about China. Was everybody kung fu fighting? Now that you're starting to write down that list, beside everything that you think you know about China, I want you to write down for yourself, where did you learn that from? Who told you about this thing? What told you? How do you know what you know about China? Even though you've never been there, how do you know? Well, I'll tell you, personally for me, this is what I knew about China growing up. Okay. My favorite movie was Disney's Mulan. I absolutely love that film. I will sing it every single time if there is karaoke. I broke my Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon CD. I wore it out from listening to it so much on the way to and from karate. Bruce Lee, because I was into martial arts, was my absolute icon. And we had one, and it was a big deal when we got it. We had one Chinese food restaurant in my small town. And that is the only Chinese food that I experienced until I was 20 years old. Okay. That's what I knew about China for the longest time in my life. And it really wasn't until I went there in person that I fully realized that what I learned from the media was not entirely accurate. That sometimes the media in various forms, be it in film, television, even the news, can give you an impression about a culture or a society that's not entirely accurate, that might have some stereotypes that could be very detrimental. And so that's the thing, is we don't know what we don't know, right? And for me, going to China later on in life, I learned so much more about that culture than I could have ever perceived before traveling there, okay? So let me go back to my story, being in a small rural town in the South. And this is the part where I said I'm going to be sharing some stuff that I don't usually publicly talk about, right? I grew up siloed in this small bubble of a town, and all that I knew was that town, and I loved the town. We had great people there, right? I had an older sister, about 5 years older than me, and she is vivacious, like a powerful force of nature, such an adventurer, wanted to explore and go see the world, never was content with being in the small town. And some people kind of pushed against her, like, hey, you're not better than us. Like, unless you're going in the military and getting deployed, like, why do you want to go abroad? We got everything we need, you know? But she pushed against that. And she decided that she was going to go to the United Kingdom and Ireland. And she was in high school. And my socioeconomic status growing up, I wasn't quite a free lunch kid, but I was like on the cusp of being a free lunch kid. So we didn't have money. My parents couldn't afford, even if their daughter wanted to go abroad, they couldn't afford to pay for it for her. So my sister took a job at McDonald's, and she worked years, actually, almost every weekend at McDonald's to save up money to go on this trip her junior year, the summer between her junior and senior year in high school. And she went to the United Kingdom and Ireland. And she would call us from there, and she would tell me all about everything that she could within very few minutes, because you know how international calls are very expensive, especially back in the day. And when she came back, she brought back souvenirs from her travels, and she told me all about the world and things that I never could think of. And in my mind, that sparked something in me that I was like, I want to be like my sister. I want to see things. I want to learn things and do things and get out and go into the future, right? And widen my perceptions. Unfortunately, when my sister was 16 years old, she was killed in a car crash. And I was 11 at the time. And the thing that always stuck with me is the most, and I do mean the most, life-changing experience that my sister ever got to have before her death was to go out and see other cultures and go out and explore the world. And I'm so glad that she had the dedication to go and do that, even when other people told her that she shouldn't even try, right? She went for it. And that awoke something in me. And so I decided I was going to get out. When I graduated high school, I left my small rural town and I moved as far enough away as I could. And I moved to Colorado. And I distinctly remember the first time I ever stood in Denver, in downtown Denver. If any of you have been, there's a mall there, 16th Street Mall, that you can walk down, and there's musicians there, there's artists there, there's people from all over in their background. You can hear different accents, you can hear different languages, you see a diverse people, and not just all white, people of color. And I remember being so overwhelmed, but in a good way, because I was intimidated, but I wanted to learn more. I wanted to interact more with people. And it really helped me come to terms with my own self. And it was when I was at university that I realized that I was LGBTQ+, because as you can imagine, with my sister's death, growing up, I was taking care of a lot of my parents. And so I didn't really have time to explore my identity in that phase where a lot of people are teenagers and figuring it out, right? I didn't have that. And so it wasn't until I was at university that I could come to terms with my own identity. And my sister's inspiration sparked me to want to continue to even expand that bubble further and go further into looking into how to study abroad. Now, being LGBTQ+ and looking to study abroad adds a whole other layer of consideration. And I'm just talking about LGBTQ+, but I could be easily talking about race, class, genders, and ability status and beyond, right? And so when I wanted to study abroad back in the day, we didn't have a ton of really great diverse organizations like we do now. I did a lot of Googling. I did like forums and blogs and looked up everything, trying to find people that traveled who were like me that could tell me, hey, this place is safe. They're okay for people who are gay. You can totally be yourself here. Here are the places you can go in the city and all of that. And basically I just turned into a huge researcher before I came to make a decision. And at my university, there happened to be a few study abroad faculty-led programs that I could afford. I wasn't able to afford a semester or longer term, but I could afford a faculty-led if I saved up the money, right? I very purposely chose a faculty-led program that was within our College of Humanities and our Visual and Performing Arts department, simply because I knew anecdotally that that's where the majority of the people who were out as LGBTQ+, where they hung out and where their majors were. And then I also, on top of that, chose a location of London, Visual and Performing Arts to London, because A, that was the least scary location for me. I'd never left the country, right? And B, it's where my sister went. And I wanted to step in her footsteps, literally, down the streets of London. And I did go. I was able to save up the money. I did have to use some student loans. I did have to tap into some scholarships, right? But I was able to go. And because I had taken the time to research and ask some questions prior to selecting this program, I was able to go and explore a new location, learn so many things. And then my peers were so open and supportive of me. I was just a normal person studying abroad. I didn't even have to think about my identity the majority of the time, but you better believe I explored Soho and all the gay districts of London while I was there. And it was such an amazing experience, and it was life-changing. As you could tell, I wouldn't be in front of this camera speaking to you if it wasn't, right? And what I learned is when you get out of your comfort zone and you're able to push past the fear of getting out of your comfort zone, if you're willing to get uncomfortable to explore things, it's when we're the most uncomfortable that we learn the most about ourselves and about the world in general. And that's what faculty-led programs do. That's what study abroad does as a principle. Global education gets you out of your comfort zone so that you can grow as a person and be empowered as a global citizen. And that's why we do what we do. That's why Holger does what he does, right? And of course, part of traveling abroad when you're part of a marginalized community means asking questions and figuring out with your own identity what's going to work best for you so that you can travel safe and travel smart and go into that growth mindset. And so I do have a few questions that I would hope that you as a student would consider as you're sitting down, and I'll talk about questions in general, and then we'll go more into direct LGBTQ, right? But what are some of the things that you're used to having every single day in your home life here in the United States versus where you're going, right? An easy way to do an example of this is if you are wheelchair bound, you're used to having certain facilities from the American Disabilities Association, right? But it's the American Disabilities Association. So what sort of accommodations should you be looking for in a host country that you're looking to study abroad in, right? What other further considerations would you have for that? And then have you met with organizations either in the location that you're going to study abroad in or at home, such as Disabilities Resource Center or your Center of Diversity or your Education Abroad office? Have you talked to them about your questions and your concerns as you're assessing what could be the best fit for you as a student? And it really comes down to, again, back to this identity well, because some of these identities are going to be very salient for you. And then the other thing to consider is study abroad, because it's getting you out of your comfort zone. It might force you to confront some of the identities that you don't normally confront. For example, I mentioned before, I came from a lower socioeconomic status growing up in my small town. And that was part of my identity for a very long time. And it still kind of is, to be frank with you. I grew up not impoverished, but I grew up pretty poor. And that's part of how I perceived my experience in the world. And then I went to Bangkok, Thailand, and I saw the slums there. And I saw true poverty. And I went to Colombia, and I went there District 13, their Comuna 13, and saw true poverty. And that had to cause me to reevaluate some of how I perceive my own identity and the privileges that I've had just from my geographical location that I grew up in. You know, you have to be prepared to really analyze yourself, because study abroad and being in a discomforting space, right, where you're not lulled by the familiar, it's going to point out some things to you that maybe you never had to confront before. And that's okay. It should, because hopefully you'll grow through those questions that you're being confronted by, right? Now, in particular for LGBTQ plus students, and for those of you on the call, I probably should have defined this earlier. If you don't know what that means, it means lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, questioning, intersex is usually in there. And then there's a variety of other facets within our community. Okay. So these next questions I'm going to specifically ask towards you, if you are a student or staff or faculty who are on the call today. So the reality is that while we are progressing as a global society, for the most part, to being a lot more open to diversity and inclusion, there are certain locations that you really do have to consider how open you're able to be and how open you're comfortable with being about your sexuality or your identity status, especially if it's a non-apparent identity versus an apparent identity going abroad. And that's what we're going to talk about next. But these are some questions that I would encourage you to really, really think about when you're considering going abroad as an LGBTQ plus individual, because there are countries in the globe right now that do have laws that are anti-homosexuality. There are laws against being gay. doesn't mean that you can't go to that country, but it does mean that you have to evaluate for yourself what your comfort level is in going to that country, all right? So think about wherever you're thinking of studying abroad, what is the law of that country regarding people of your identity facet, okay? What housing would you feel comfortable in? I, in my everyday life, am constantly helping out education abroad offices where students come to them that are of a differing gender identity than the cisgendered, someone who is transgendered or non-binary, who has this question about homestays and making sure that they can come out to their host family when they're abroad and how to approach that. And there are a lot of resources out there now that you can take advantage of to kind of help answer some of those questions. And I would also encourage you, if you are LGBTQ+, reach out to your on-campus contacts, reach out to Holger, reach out to Lauren and the Center of Diversity, because there are people that want to support you and have systems in place that can get information for you, as well as you reaching out to a variety of other resource organizations to try and evaluate what your options are, okay? So I do want to highlight this map to you, okay? If you look at this map, granted it's a little dated, it's from 2019. So this is a map basically telling you the safest countries that people who identify as LGBT can travel to. If you notice here on the map, the brightest pink is the safest, considered the safest for people to be out and not have to tailor their identity or censor themselves while abroad. There are places on this map that you can see that are rated F, or they are the darkest on this map for being not accepting of LGBT. Here's what I will tell you before I move forward with my story. Just because there's a place on this map that might be marked black for F, for safety, doesn't mean you can't go there. You'll notice that China is not very accepting. I've been to China. I never had an issue in China. Granted, that's my own personal experience, right? I can't project that out to everyone's experience who goes to China. But it doesn't mean that you can't go. It just means that you have to be more cognizant before you go. For example, going to China, I had to fill out the Chinese visa information. I had just married my wife, and the Chinese visa asked for your marital status and to list your spouse's name. And I had to actually ask some of my colleagues who are on our dedicated visa team at WorldStrides, I had to ask them and say, is this okay? Should I list my same-sex spouse on this visa, or should I leave it off, right? And I ended up doing it. I listed it. I didn't lie about it or anything like that. And I went to China and it was perfectly fine. And my visa is still active. I can go back if I so choose for the next 10 years. But these are things to realize, is just because it may seem discouraging to go to a destination doesn't mean that you can't go. Okay, you just have to be very careful in how you evaluate where you're going to go for your study abroad. And now we're going to go back to my story for a minute, because I'm going to fast forward to after my undergraduate. I had done my London study abroad. I was in grad school. And in my graduate program, they were working on a direct partnership with a university in Russia. And they were encouraging some of us in the cohort to do a semester abroad with this university partnership that they were brokering in Russia. And I was approached and basically offered the opportunity to study abroad in Russia. Now, it's very important to note a few things. By the time I was in grad school, I had come fully to terms with my own identity as being a lesbian. I was not straight passing, meaning that it was very easy for people to find my sexual orientation as apparent versus non-apparent, right? And at that time, I didn't really have an interest in closeting myself anymore. I just wasn't in my own personal journey in the stage where I wanted to censor myself. The other thing that I had to take into account when I had this opportunity to study abroad in Russia was the timing of it. This was, it might be dating myself a little bit here, but this was back during Sochi in the Olympics. And there were huge protests in Russia happening at the time because they had just recently passed an anti-gay propaganda law, which meant essentially that if you were out and you talked about being out, you could meet violence and legal action. And these protests did get violent in Russia. And essentially, it was a very difficult decision. It's a decision I still think about to this day, but it was the right decision for me personally. I chose to decline the study abroad opportunity to go to Russia, simply because I didn't want to be closeted. I didn't want to have to be straight passing. I just wanted to be me. But that was my own personal choice. That doesn't mean if you want to go to Russia that you shouldn't go to Russia. I'll give you an example in contrast. There's a student at the University of Wyoming who is openly gay, and he studies Russian language and history. And he also had the opportunity to study abroad in Russia, and he wants to go. He wanted to go. And what was really great for him is he reached out to his education abroad office. He reached out to their multicultural office so that they could all do research. He did a ton of research on his side. They did a ton of research on their side because they wanted to support him, but they were skeptical of his safety. And after doing all the research, they discovered, well, actually, if I'm okay being closeted and I'm okay not talking about my sexuality, because to me, it's a non-apparent thing, I can blend in as straight passing. My studies in Russian and Russia history, I want to go. And he went. He went to Russia for a semester and he studied language and he studied history in Russia. And he will admit to you that yes, there were times where he felt siloed. There were times where he felt censored and isolated. But he actually managed to find people in Russia that were also LGBTQ+, that were locals. And so he found and tapped into this underground community, if you will, of his peers that were local to Russia. And it turned into an incredibly positive experience for him. But he had to make that decision for himself as to being okay with editing his expression and his outness in order to do that study abroad opportunity. But of course, it was incredibly valuable opportunity for him to have, especially in his area of study. Okay? So essentially what I want to leave you with today is to let you know, if you get nothing else out of this presentation today, I want you to know that you're not alone, that there are people like you or people from variety of backgrounds and identity sets that also want to study abroad. And yes, it's an extra consideration. Let's be honest. It is. I have to think about my sexual orientation almost on a daily basis, unfortunately, because of the society that we live in sometimes. But please know that there are people out there that want to support you, that want you to have as many opportunities as possible and want to empower you to be able to have your own voice and make your own decisions about your global education, and not think that any identity facet, be it from coming from a low socioeconomic status to coming from a rural background to being a part of a marginalized identity facet, none of these things should be able to hold you back from making the best decision for yourself. And on the screen, you'll notice a few links that I have to different organizations out here that you can actually research with. I would very much especially like to highlight Diversity Abroad. Diversity Abroad is not just for LGBTQ+. They really do a great job of looking at that full identity wheel and then giving students great information and resources that they can utilize in making decisions about what could be a good fit for a study abroad program for that person. Know that we also have, just like we have national LGBTQ+ organizations and even regional and state level LGBTQ+ organizations, we have international ones too. And that's something that you can easily tap into as an international work of organization of all of our peers abroad, and is really cool to see how the LGBTQ+ culture might shift. Like it's a little different in London than it is in Spain, than it is in Colombia, than it is in China. But it's really cool to still have that cross-cultural interaction and learn about our own community on an international level. There are also places out there that are organizations that will give you tips for travel safety and travel awareness and having a good idea of what the climate is and wherever you're traveling to. For those of you who maybe are transgender and you would like for your government documents, such as your passport and ID, to match your gender identity, there are organizations particularly focused on helping you do that and achieve that so that you can feel comfortable when you're traveling abroad. For me, as an undergrad, I tapped into a ton of blogs. I tapped into, like, I guess what you would call Reddit today. Back in my day, they were just forums, okay? But I tapped into blogs and I follow different bloggers on social media even today that are traveling, that are diverse from a variety of different identities and backgrounds, and their testimonies of their experience while abroad. So just know that if you have doubt, reach out. And if for you, for lower socioeconomic status, perhaps, if you're concerned about the cost, because that is oftentimes the biggest barrier outside of trying to figure out the identity climate, reach out again to your education abroad office, reach out to your foundation if you have it, go online and look for scholarships. There are scholarships everywhere for any possible thing that you can imagine. You just have to look for them. And if you're not sure, and if it's a faculty-led program, your education abroad office might be working with a provider that has specialized scholarships. Like, for example, I'll do a quick plug for WorldStrides. This week, we introduced a diversity, equity, and inclusion scholarship specifically with the goal in mind that students could apply to it that are typically underrepresented in study abroad populations, right? So there are a lot of initiatives in place right now, and that are only growing in the future to make sure that we can help you feel supported and funded as you're exploring study abroad opportunities. But all that said, if you got nothing else from the presentation today, I really do hope that it helped give you a little bit more information, a little bit more to think about as far as what to consider when going abroad, and also some self-analysis to really consider, what does your identity mean to you, and how does that maybe influence your perceptions of the world and of other cultures and of yourself. That said, that is all for my presentation, Holger. I don't know if you wanted to do any Q&A. I'll probably stop sharing if that's okay. That way I can see your faces. There we go.
That's great, thank you. So first of all, thank you so much for your presentation. Your personal story is touching, moving, but also super encouraging. So big thank you for sharing your personal story. It's highly appreciated. And I hope everybody in a certain segment of identity finding, identity crisis, might now understand or get some resources and understand that there is resource, there is help. At the University of South Dakota, the Gallagher Center, our staff has safe zone training. We have the Center for Diversity and Community on campus. We have the financial aid office on campus, supporting also socioeconomic background and advising scholarships. So yeah, there are tons of resources out there, and I think that's a good way to communicate that with this presentation. Again, if somebody's here on the Zoom call or on the Facebook live stream, feel free to put a question in the chat. We decided to have chat questions for several reasons. So while you think about a question to Julie, I can ask my first question. I have the privilege. What is your favorite country to travel to and why?
Yeah, I feel like this is such a stereotypical answer. Italy, by far and away. It's a personal thing. My favorite place in the entire world is in Portovenere, which is in Cinque Terre in Italy. And it's at the very, very, very tip of Cinque Terre. And there's a beautiful chapel there and an old fort. And there's a cove, and the waves on that cove are unlike anything I've ever seen in my life. And that it gave me such a sense of power being there, but also really humbling sense of knowing how small I was in the world. And so that is my favorite place in the whole wide world to travel to for that reason. Yeah.
Yeah, I can see Italy is also on my top list of travel destinations. We have a question in chat. What specific resources for LGBTQ community is provided by students by WorldStrides? Is there anything on the website that students might find helpful in preparations for their study abroad experience? Thank you for the question.
Yeah, that's a really great question. WorldStrides has a huge initiative for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And that's something that we've been expanding year after year. We do have an amazing vice president of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Her name's Malika Serrano. A few of you on the call I know are familiar with her. I adore her. We do have a diversity, equity, inclusion website that we're working on right now to have fully launched to give students a bit more resources. We also are a member of Diversity Abroad. So a lot of the resources that we have, we're trying to share out to students. I will tell you personally, I am the co-chair of our Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee within our higher ed space. And as such, what we're working on right now are a variety of resources, both internal but also external, to help with education abroad offices, with faculty, and tackling some of these topics about identity facets that maybe they are not as familiar with, that way they can feel fully supported with students. So if you have any particular questions of that, I'm more than happy to follow up with that information as well. The other thing that I would encourage is partnering with the University Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Center, or Center of Diversity. And oftentimes what happens, and what I've done in the past, at least in my role of WorldStrides, is I've worked with the Education Abroad Office and their diversity center to essentially come up with resources completely customized for that university and for those students. And our VP, Malika Serrano, she is so great. She does faculty workshops as well. So if that's something that you have a desire to offer at your university, either for your staff or for your faculty or both, that's something that she would be able to come out and schedule with you to do.
Yeah, and I went to some of her webinars, and they are really amazing and lots of information there. I also wanted to mention on the University of South Dakota campus, we also have organizations like TRIO. We also have organizations like the Native American Center. So talking about identity, it's so widespread that I think there is a resource out there for everyone. Is it okay also to ask personal questions?
Yes, that's totally fine.
Okay, cool. So when you studied abroad in, let's say, England, and you mentioned exploring Soho and the communities there. So what is your personal experience from growing up in the south of the United States, living in Colorado, and then going to other countries and exploring communities there of their other countries? And then we're talking about individual experience, not generalizations.
Yes.
The people you met, their identity, their struggles, maybe, or confident, maybe, in their identity compared to how you grew up here in the US?
That's a really great question, Holger. Yes, so one of my very, very best friends is Sri Lankan, and he had come out to the United States University. He is gay, he's straight passing. He is not out because Sri Lanka does not view that in positive light, unfortunately. But so for him, coming from that background, I think that he definitely had to perfect how to be in the closet. And he was confident in who he was, but I think that he had to take extra steps to be considerate of his identity and how he navigated in Sri Lanka. When he came to the United States, granted, in his particular context of the university, it was a military academy, and don't ask, don't tell was in effect back then. So he couldn't even be out then, really. So it wasn't until later on that he could really be out and embrace his identity status. It really depends on the country. And that's why I come back to his story, is for me in the United States, growing up in the South, I thought at the time that there was maybe 2 or 3 other people at our high school that were LGBTQ plus. Nobody was out. Nobody was out in my high school. So I didn't meet another person like me until college. And so for me, it took a while for me to feel deeply rooted in my identity, because I never really had that interaction with my own community until I was able to get to a more diverse space in Colorado. And then in London, I think it's even taking that to a whole other scale, because then, yeah, I'm in Colorado, but London is one of the biggest, most international cities in the entire world, right? And so that just further diversified everything, and everybody had like a melting pot, if you will, of them and their own identities and their sexuality, and coming to terms with that within their own culture, and then them coming together in London. It's a very unique melting pot of how to navigate identity. But I guess I would say, as a person coming from the South, where again, I was very siloed in my small town, which is neither good nor bad, right? But it just was what it was. I think that it did take me a little bit of an adjustment to come to terms with my own identity. And then also I became incredibly curious for anybody that I met in my community to know their story and know their perspective on it, and how their country of origin could have influenced them, and their other identity facets that have influenced them, and come to terms with that. Is that
There's a
Holger? Sorry.
Yeah, sure. And I will follow up. Also, like asking the questions in chat, so we might bounce around a little bit. So there's a question to you. What is the coolest festival you participated in a while? I assume it's like music, but it could be all kind of, maybe poetry slam, whatever festival you can think of.
Yeah, I would love to say Oktoberfest. I haven't gotten to do that yet.
It is cool, I can tell you that.
So I don't know that I would call it a festival. But when I was in Venice, so for those of you who've been to Venice, or if you haven't been, so to give you an idea of Venice, it's not a festival. So I haven't really been to a festival, I would say, while abroad. But in Venice, there are these gondoliers, because of course the streets are water, like it's channels of water going throughout. And there are these gondoliers that have a very long history. It's passed down generation over generation, right? And they have people that will pay to go in this gondola, this boat, and they'll go through these channels, and you can pay extra and you can have musicians and vocalists in the gondolier with you. And I think the coolest experience I had was at dusk. So the sun hadn't quite set, and my wife and I were about to head into a little opera while we were in Venice. And these gondoliers were crossing paths in the alleyways, and their voices, just the acoustics of how the buildings in Venice are built with stone and stucco, their voices echoed and intermingled in such a beautiful way. And you had violinists, and it was just this really cool experience of like seeing and hearing these gondolas cross, and like how their music blended together and then echoed out and everybody could appreciate it. That's probably the coolest moment that I'd say I've had. That wasn't a festival per se, but it was musically based, and really stuck with me. Mm-hmm.
I would say that is a really good festival.
Yeah, it was pretty cool.
Yeah, that is more than pretty cool. So talking about, let's say, LGBTQ plus students, let's say a student wants to explore this identity more. What would be good, you mentioned London, but what would be good destinations around the globe to go to live? I mean, you showed the map, but to live free, to explore identity, to maybe they're coming from a small town, South Dakota, where, as you mentioned, it's silo, and they want to explore their identity more. So what would be good locations to go?
That's really great. I would say, and this is going to sound a little silly because it's almost like it's in your backyard. It's probably a few hours drive from you, but Canada. Canada is incredibly open, incredibly accepting. It's right there. And that's something that you could really explore on a budget. If you're on a budget and you don't want to do a transatlantic flight. My first international flight was when I studied abroad, and I didn't know what to make of it, right? For the while there. Canada's right there. I would say in particular for the area of South Dakota, especially if you have a lot of roots that go back to Scandinavia, to the Vikings, to Iceland, to metal music, if you like that, in Norway and all that. Scandinavia is incredibly open and accepting. Most parts of Western Europe are very accepting. The Pacific, Australia, New Zealand, incredibly accepting. A place in Asia that I would recommend if you're looking to really delve into studying your own identity and sexuality and how that could be different abroad, I would highly encourage Thailand. Thailand has an incredibly rich LGBTQ plus culture, and it really gives you a unique experience of a highly spiritual nation that also embraces in a lot of ways diversity within gender and sexuality. I would very much recommend that. And it's also a very affordable place on the ground for you if you have a limited budget. Granted, the airfare can be a bit more expensive. But yeah, I would probably say top of that list, Scandinavia, Canada, Western Europe, and the United Kingdom.
Yeah, I can confirm that with Canada. I've been to Toronto and Vancouver. And in Vancouver, there's a whole neighborhood similar to Soho in England, where, and that might be stereotype, but it's really nice to explore and fun to explore, where the crossing is not black and white, it's rainbow color, and the bus stops are colored in pink. So they play a lot with stereotypes, but it's really a fun area to hang out and to explore. Besides even not being member of any kind of LGBTQ community and just want to explore a different cultural area. Yeah. Coming back to your other experience about finances. So you mentioned scholarships, you mentioned financial aid and everything. So what would you advise for students thinking money is a big issue, finance is a big issue to study abroad? There are resources out there, working, saving money. What are other things you can advise students?
Yeah, I would say take a look, especially if you, and I don't know if USD, if you have a foundation office, but a lot of times if you do, you can reach out to that foundation office. I don't want to speak on behalf of Laura, but if she has through the Center of Diversity, different organizations that she works with and networks with, you can do outreach through that way. The other thing that I would talk about is a lot of the larger LGBTQ plus organizations out there may have scholarships for students, in particular students of a certain identity facet. And even if you're LGBTQ plus, that's not to say that you should only go after LGBTQ plus scholarships. Like, you're a multifaceted being, right? You're not just one label. And there are scholarships out there for almost anybody. The biggest thing that I would encourage, and if this is you and you're watching this right now, or you see a recording of this, student, I'm speaking directly to you right now, student, okay? I used to work to help students go to college from all different diverse backgrounds. A lot of times there's this weird mythology or stereotype that people think that in order to get a scholarship, you have to be valedictorian in your class, or the president of student government, or have an amazing resume if you're a non-traditional student, or volunteer every single weekend. Like, they think that it's not obtainable. And I'm here to tell you today, students, it is, okay? There are tons of scholarships that go unused year after year, simply because students don't think that they would qualify for them, so they don't even try. And that makes me a little gut-wrenched, heart-wrenched, if you will, because if you're willing to try and you're willing to go online and do the research, there are a ton of scholarship databases out there. If you go and look for them, just hit the Google. Let's be honest, just go out and search for them. You'll find them. And take the time, write a good personal statement, because that personal statement can really set you apart from anything. I don't care if you have a 1.3, a 2.5, a 4.0 GPA. At the end of the day, if you're willing to tell your story, people respect that, okay? I personally serve on our scholarship committees for WorldStrides in higher ed, okay? And I can tell you, for our scholarship committees, we look at multiple things. We look at a personal statement, we look at letters of recommendation, we look at your unofficial transcripts, but we also keep in mind the academic rigor of your program, right? And all of these things synthesized together is going to give us a story. And we choose the student based off of the story, not off of GPA. It's a factor, but it's not the only factor. All right. So if you think that you can't qualify for scholarships, I'm here to tell you, you really, really, really can. They are out there. You just got to be willing to look for them, and you've got to be willing to take the time and effort to write the personal statements and really put your hat in the ring and submit an application for them to be considered.
Great advice, and I totally agree. And Steph in the Gallagher Center, Jessica Winteringer, our study abroad advisor, and Virginia Wilcox, our director, they are trained in supporting students in writing letter of intent, motivation letter, and statements. So we are also supporting students. So if you as a student listening now or watching now and you're like afraid or any concerns, come talk. Only when you talk and ask questions, we can help you. Last question. I don't see any more questions on the live stream or in the chat. Why should students, no matter what background, no matter what identity, but why should a student study abroad?
I'm going to sound very philosophical in my answer. So bear with me, students, in my philosophical approach to this answer. Why should students study abroad? I think that it comes back to why people should learn anything. I think it should come back to why experience life. The whole goal of experiencing life, the whole goal of experiencing education is for your own personal growth. When you are willing to go somewhere outside of that comfort zone, you're going to be the most uncomfortable, but you're going to learn the most. You have the most potential for growth and progress and realization than you would have if you had just simply stayed in a silo bubble and never explored it. Here's what I will tell you, okay? A lot of times we're brought up to believe that we have a set identity and a set moral and that everything's in boxes and we need to adhere to this list to be successful, or that we need to embody certain codes. Or here's what I would tell you. Go out and use critical thinking and use compassion to soak in as much as you can from the world, because in a healthy way, let me preface that, in a healthy, happy way, right? Non-toxic. But take it all in, because what's going to happen is when you get all of this feedback, if you get all of these knowledge points and these experiences, you're going to take that in and you're going to synthesize it. And what happens is that you not only learn more about the world, you learn more about yourself. And to be frank with you, there are people who go their entire lives that never truly get to discover themselves. Study abroad is a way for you to push yourself to go for more, to really get down to the crux of what do you value? What do you really truly value about life? What do you believe? Whatever it is. And what will you fight for? You're going to grow the most, I argue, in an uncomfortable, unexplored setting. And what is the best form of unexplored setting than the whole wide world outside of your everyday life? Just try it. I think that you'll be fascinated. I learned so much about myself and my identity and my values through study abroad that I never confronted before. It forced me to confront some things about my own upbringing. And it was a good thing that I confronted those things, because I would hope that I became a better person because of it. I hope, right? So that's my deeply philosophical answer.
That is a really good answer. Since there are no questions left, in the chat, there are tons of questions, tons of topics to discuss, but for now, again, thank you so much for sharing your personal story. It is moving, it's touching, it's really encouraging, and it shows your courage and your growth. Your contact information, we have it on the live stream, so people can click on the WorldStrides link and it directs them to the Facebook page of WorldStrides to contact you, or they can contact the Gallagher Center if they think about studying abroad, and we can connect them with you. Thank you everyone who joined this presentation. We had a great time, and I wish everybody a great rest of the day.
Thank you all for having me. I really appreciate it. And if there are any questions that went unanswered, feel free, Holger, if you want to share them with me. I'm more than happy to email responses after the fact.
Sure. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.